Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well today. Sorry if my voice was off in the last couple of videos. I think I said it in my other video, but I unfortunately got a recurring viral throat infection and it made it really difficult to record. I did as many as I could, but obviously it had a limit. But we are recovering now and we're probably like 70 or 80% back to normal. So I hope my voice sounds a lot more normal in these stories. And if you want early access to my stories, then make sure you check out my Patreon and make sure you check out my podcast in the description below too. And I have a quick message before the story starts. So for today, I'd like to share this. Remember that it is important to have outlets for stress and other things like that. And it's important to have people that you know that you can trust and talk to. Obviously, be careful about who you choose for these things, but it might be a close family or a close friend. But I think if you keep everything in your head all day and you never release it, it's kind of where the ideas just bounce around and can become quite toxic sometimes. I know for myself, I used to think the best thing for me is to just sit on my own and think my way out of this, but all it did was made me feel much worse and ended up ruminating and spiraling down a lot. Like, if you haven't done it for a while, I'd really suggest it just to release some of the stress and pressure. And make sure that you have other things that you enjoy doing, because a balanced version of yourself is always going to be the best self, and it's going to be able to overcome the most. Even if it feels like you only want to work, and work your way through things, you're going to get burnt out that way, and that's only going to lead to you feeling more down. So make sure that you have balance and do the things that you enjoy. I'm probably not always the best at doing that, and I have to really make sure that I schedule it into my week. But make sure you can do it. I think it's really important. So I hope that can help somebody, and I hope you enjoyed these stories. I'll speak to you all soon. Now, I work in a national park as a park ranger, and I remembered something that happened one evening. I'd went out near our station to drink my coffee. It's kind of a ritual that I had, and it was important for me to stay awake and alert enough to do my job effectively at night, when I hear a really loud crash. Now, not even 1 feet next to me, a huge boulder smashes into the ground. It scares me how close it is, and I jump back. Before I really have time to react to this, I hear somebody shouting at me, "Hey, watch out. The aliens are coming, man. The aliens are coming. You have to hide." And then I see somebody with a very long beard, very unkempt hair, a very old hat and clothes who sprints past me. He sprints so quick that I honestly don't think he's human for a second. Now, I stood there completely grounded. I want to say I was brave, but I just realized that this guy was probably trying to kill me with the rock. Within a second, I snap into life and I quickly get into the station, report what's just happened and call the police, and we send out our search party. Now, our party found absolutely nothing and ordered the police, so that crazy person could still be out there waiting to throw rocks at people's heads and kill them. I'm just glad that he missed me. Me and a buddy of mine had been called out to go and investigate a tent that was put somewhere it shouldn't have been. You're not supposed to camp in this part of our forest, and there was an old army green tent set up. We're almost there when my buddy stops and says, "Hey, can you hear that?" I say, "What?" I can then very faintly make out the sounds of somebody singing. The more and more I listen to it, it's children singing Ring a Ring of Hoses. It sounds like maybe 4 or 5 of them. They all have different voices. This goes on for about 2 minutes, very faintly. I turn on my flashlight and have a look around in all directions. We cannot locate where the sound is coming from. It sounds like it's right next to us. We turn off the flashlights again and it stops, and we think maybe it's coming from the tent. Quite scared now, we go closer and closer to the tent until somebody emerges. We say, "Hey, you're not supposed to be here." He says, "Oh, I'm really sorry. I just needed to rest for a bit." And the guy was actually really nice and said that he didn't realize he wasn't supposed to be. We then ask him, does he know where the singing was coming from? And he looks at us and says no, he was about to ask the same question. He packs up his things and we show him the way back because it's dark. We start to set off and we hear children laughing, just like before. Now the look of fear I've never seen in the other guys before. I must have had the exact same expression as we realise that something is off. We quickly scan the torches around and very quickly scan the area and can't find anything. We then make it hurriedly back to our relative safety. I did some research at the area and apparently there have been reports of similar things happening before. Children laughter in the night, but nobody's ever able to locate where the sound comes from or the accompanied singing. One of the main responsibilities I had working in my national park is to make sure that I survey the climate testing devices. I'm not in the United States of America too, so it might be different out there, but we really put a lot of emphasis on to checking the air quality and trying to maintain it. We try and keep it to the highest possible standard that we can, and it's not really easy, but we have lots of trees, which is really a good thing. Now on this particular day, I set out to check the first 3 posts and they were fine. I go into the 4th and final one and it's starting to get dark. I can then see that there's a colleague who's already there, so I don't think much of it. I just continue doing my job and do a friendly wave, but I don't get one back. I turn around and go to do my other task, hoping that this person has done it for me, expecting them to catch up with me. I then realise that they look odd. Something about the way that they're standing hunched over just doesn't sit right with me. It doesn't look like somebody who's happy and healthy, it looks like somebody who's a little bit off. I don't know, just their whole demeanour seems really strange to me. I then shine my flashlight over thinking maybe they're in trouble, and I get the fright of my life. I'm met with something that is wearing an all dark robe, has a very weird goat kind of face and looks like what I can only describe as the devil, with completely black eyes. It's probably about 7 feet tall and slowly turns to face me. I drop the flashlight and within a moment I'm bolting the opposite direction. Eventually I make it back to the station and I frantically explain what's happened, and some of the other guys go to check it out. We can't find anything, just my flashlight and its dying light now because it's been out there in the cold for a while. We don't find a person or devil, but we do find something weird. There are hoof marks in the ground, exactly where I saw this thing. Weirdly, there's none leading away, just perfectly in the position that I saw this thing standing there. We never saw this thing again, but it actually is in our folklore to have things like this around, so I'm certain what I saw was probably the devil or some kind of demonic entity. The Okefenokee Swamp is mostly located in South Georgia and partly in North Florida. I've been going to there since I was a kid. Now, my dad and uncle are avid outdoorsmen. They're always canoeing, hiking, hunting, fishing, etc. And I grew up learning to love the same things. Now, if the first thing that came to your mind when I said swamp was alligators, you'd be correct. This swamp has some of the biggest around. It may sound super scary to non-southerners, but the same old thing is really true. If you leave them alone, they'll leave you alone too. Now, slowly canoeing across the dark, cold waters, if you ever pass one, it will quickly sink into the muddy depths. He's not going to come and get you. You've simply interrupted his sunbathing. As elementary school kids in South Georgia, it's kind of a rite of passage to go on the swamp field trip, led by a guided tour by someone called Joe. Hell of a name. Joe was a true outdoorsman. I might be extremely knowledgeable, maybe friendly, yeah, and good with the kids and funny. A little strange, but generally regarded as a good guy, a local legend. He would get the boat closer to the big gators than my dad would ever let me get. He taught us kids all about them. We even got to hear about the mating call of some of the males and watch a lot of behaviour super close up. He would also allow us to see the birds and snakes and other wildlife. The swamp residents were so used to Joe's boat that they didn't flee when he got close. Great memories. Anyhow, fast forward to my adulthood and I still have a great love of the outdoors. I'd recently gotten married and was successfully getting my wife and stepdaughter into kayaking, camping and hiking. I'd broken them in fairly easy calm lakes with beautiful crystal clear water. Now during our time, we'd actually encountered some gators, but the girls had become fairly comfortable with the fact that they weren't going to get hunted by them. I decided it was time to go to this old swamp and show them my childhood swamp stomping grounds, so we headed out one weekend, kind of on a whim. I hadn't called ahead to reserve a campsite, but I presumed that they weren't too busy just yet. Well, I was wrong. Every tent on the campsite was booked. I was pretty visibly bummed out, so I guess the ranger felt sorry for me. She told us, hold on. She was going to get one more thing that she could check for us. When she came back, she had great news. There was a primitive group site available. If you aren't familiar, these are larger sites that are usually for big groups like Boy Scouts. These are also usually situated away from some of the larger areas and main camping grounds. They don't have electricity. We camp 100% primitive all the time though, so it wasn't an issue for us. The ranger told us that this particular group site had been closed for 2 months due to seasons actually washing out the road. Now she said that they just fixed the road the week before, but hadn't actually gotten around to relisting the site as available. She offered to sell it to us for a normal fee instead of the camp group fee deal. We pay and she vaguely shows us on the map how to get there before we get back home for the night. I remembered thinking, wow, that's pretty far from the other sites. It's gotta be nice and quiet, perfect. While at the office, we learned that evening there was going to be a ranger guided night paddle. This particular park inside of the swamp is designated dark sky park, meaning very little night population and light pollution. I was already excited about showing my family the stars of Milky Way, so getting out onto the water at night and seeing the skies at the same time seemed sweet. We decided to sign up for the night paddle and then headed off to our campsite. When we got out there, you could tell right away that it hadn't been used in several years. There was overgrown spider webs everywhere, teeming with the usual wildlife. I kind of in a way prefer it this way, so don't actually think twice about it. Now, it was so far from the campgrounds and the main office area that you couldn't hear a single human voice or vehicle. The area was so large that I walked around for a bit to find a good spot to actually set up, and had a lot of choice. I then refer back to my map and I'm trying to gauge just how big the island is and what the shape of it is, and notice that what I was seeing and what the map showed don't quite line up. Whatever, I could be wrong, so we set up the camp and just enjoyed the sunshine and the sounds of nature. It was still very early spring, so hordes of mosquitoes and various other swamp bugs weren't out in full force just yet. The bugs in the swamp in the summer months could be a horror story of their own. Around 7:30, we loaded up the kayaks into my pickup and headed all the way across the park to the launch area, as our guided paddle was supposed to start at 8. Now, we approached the launch area and unload, and there was about a good 15 or 20 people ready for their paddle, led by an enthusiastic young ranger. We slipped off into the water with our headlamps on the red light setting. Now, we exit the small canal that we had been travelling in and emerge out into a large river type waterway that meandered through the swamp, and we slowly and quietly creep along, going through some of the trees which are draped in Spanish moss, which is kind of looming over us on both sides now. with a dramatic orange sunset in the back, forming our backdrop. The sun then finally began to disappear and the stars began to come out. It's absolutely stunning and still one of my favourite kayaking memories. I'd never actually seen the Milky Way like that before. It was a new moon night, dark as it could be. About a mile from our original launch, we were all congregated out in the middle of the waterway and sat completely still and quiet. The motionless dark waters of the swamp actually reflect the skies like a mirror, and you can see thousands of stars and galaxies twinkling above and below us. It was like being in space, not just simply to observe it. Shooting stars are also visible every few minutes. It was really magical. The only artificial light in the sky was the dull glow of Jacksonville, Florida on the horizon, which was about 100 miles to our southeast. After a while, the ranger stopped all of us in our trances. It's time to go back. Now, when we're heading out there, it had been dusk and twilight for most of the trip. Not much light, but enough to kind of see the silhouette of trees and branches against the sky and the light glimmer on the water. But by now, it's pitch black, and I do mean pitch black. The ranger told us to switch our headlamps back on to the normal white light setting so that we can actually navigate out of the swamp. As each headlamp slowly switched on, the swamp is illuminated and met with hundreds of glowing eyes, and I mean hundreds, I swear to you. Now, as I said earlier, I grew up there. Gators are really nothing new to me or scary. However, growing up, we never stayed out on the waters past dark. We would shine our lights out and over the water to look at all the eyes, but from dry land, far away from the beasts. Now I found myself and my little family quite literally pushing past floating gators with our kayaks. They were absolutely everywhere, all over the sides of the channel as well as blocking up our way in the centre. The ranger was leading and assumed everybody wasn't going to worry and told us not to worry. He paddled up towards a huge group of shining eyes up ahead of us and actually pushes through them. Most of them disappeared under the water, but the gator directly in front of the ranger's path thrashed. His tail actually hit the kayak. Now, sharp gasps come from everyone, whereas before it was the quiet southern air, but the ranger showed no signs of panic, which was actually reassuring. We all just trusted the young man that we weren't going to annoy any of these by kayaking straight into them. As we went along, there's the sounds of gators bumping by the kayaks and thrashing heard every couple of minutes. There weren't any other jarring sounds or movements, just a constant calling of frogs and other things splashing, and other old dinosaurs there. When we finally turned back into the small channel that led to the launch, there were no more glowing eyes. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't scared, but I can honestly say that I wasn't panicking. The ranger being so cool and confident while leading the way made it pretty easy to remain calm. Everybody started to relax again as we neared the launch and all got out. I loaded up our bows and one by one we head back to our camps. There was a line of red towel lights tailing off towards the main campground, while my wife, daughter, and myself split off alone into the darkness towards the other side of the park where our site is. I do remember that kind of eerie feeling, but everybody made it through the gator area with no problems. Now we're laughing about it, remarking on how cool the experience was, basically in high spirits and no stress. We had no idea of the terror that would come later on in the night though, that is, however. So we finally get back to our site at around midnight, and we were starving. Now I got a nice fire going while my wife prepared dinner for us all. I was excited for that. The meal finishes cooking at around 1 AM, and we all finally settle down and get comfy by the fire and start to eat. Now I hadn't taken 2 bites of my food when the horrifying experience began. The frogs were singing, but you basically drown that out as background sound because it's so constant. Now suddenly, out of the calming buzz of their singing, was a sound that I'll never forget. A low rumbling, guttural growl, long and deep, vibrating our chests. We all look at each other froze, like, did you all hear that? Not even 10 seconds later we hear it again. Yeah, we heard that. It sounded close, like really close, like right on the other side of the bush that we were camping next to. The only thing that I can relate it to is the sound of that T-Rex in Jurassic Park. I was terrified. I've been scared in the woods and swamps. I've seen swamp gas, freaky figures and heard screams. I've been in the Marine Corps. I've encountered bears in the Appalachian Mountains. I've explored and experienced all kinds of things. When I tell you I've never been this scared, I mean it. Pure, raw, primordial fear. I immediately told the girls to get into the cab of my pickup. They get into the truck and I hop into the bed of my truck with my little 357 Magnum drawn. I figured being back there would make it great for me to get up off the ground and have a little advantage over whatever was coming. I tell the girls to lock the doors and open the little sliding back window so we can communicate. I start frantically shining my flashlight around, aiming my gun along with it, and I see absolutely nothing. We continuously hear the growling coming from one direction, not getting any softer or louder. It just continuously emits in 3 to 5 second long intervals every 30 or so seconds. It was coming from the brush right next to our site now. I shine my lights all over the area but I met with nothing, just thick leaves, underbrush and pine. No movement though. Then suddenly, we hear the sound coming from the complete opposite direction, towards the open area of our site. I whip around and shine my light that way, and that's when I noticed the dense fog that had settled into the entire area. It was a damp, sticky, suffocating fog. Almost right away, the growling sound come back from the original direction. I whip around, but immediately, I hear it behind me. I then realize there's two of them, doing a kind of call and answer with each other. That's when I realize the other sounds have gone quiet. The swamp is now silent. I hear nothing but the call and answer of whatever these are, making absolutely gut-wrenching sounds. It got deafeningly quiet for a moment, nothing but the heavy fog, which seems to have a sound of its own. Now my wife, with shaky trembling voice, told me that she wanted to leave immediately, and that our daughter agreed. Now I was absolutely terrified. Do not misunderstand this, however. The thought of just leaving all my expensive camping gear behind me was more offensive. Not to mention I'm getting kind of annoyed now. I'm very at home in this swamp and I know all of the creatures here. I'm comfortable here. It's borderline annoying me that something here scared and confused me. I start trying to rationalize what could have made the sound. Suddenly it starts off again, but there's 4 or 5 of them, all growling back and forth at each other, overlapping now, from all sides. A demonic chorus of rattling, soul-sucking rumbles, not getting any closer or further away, just keeping us closely surrounded. No, I would have found it hard to believe anything could have made this sound. I now keep myself somewhat cool by saying it must be animals. I wouldn't even entertain the thought of anything supernatural or cryptic though. It's not that I don't believe in it, I'm just trying to not be scared. My wife keeps telling me it sounds like a big cat, which I agreed. I knew it wasn't. It would have had to have been massive lions or tigers to keep making that extremely low grumbling growl. Impossible. I racked my brains for the biggest animal, and it's an alligator. Yet we just paddled directly through the swarm of them. Some of them are absolutely massive, and they hadn't made a single sound that whole time when in the water. Now what could it be? I even thought of that young ranger and think maybe he's playing some kind of joke on us all here, but I doubt it. I have no idea what it could have been. I'm not even able to capture a glimpse of it so I can take a shot to protect my family. I'm feeling helpless. I really wish I had more words of how I felt, but just blindly standing there in the back of that truck, hearing what I could only imagine are the scariest, eeriest things on the planet. It was a horrible feeling. Now, I felt like we were there for an eternity, but we'd probably been in there for about 15 minutes or so. It's finally gone quiet again. I told the girls we could leave, but not leave in my gear. I climbed into the cab and started to get the truck, go in and move things. I ended up positioning the truck where I could shine the headlights onto our stuff while I pack it all up. Gun in hand, I began rolling up the tent, gathering all of our things together into the bed of the truck, praying nothing crazy happened, like my truck dying or something else perfectly timed like that from a horror film. I tried to put on a confident air. I'm really trying not to scare my family, but in that moment I felt so vulnerable, like something's prey. The growling still hadn't come back, but honestly, the silence was freaking me out more than anything. And the fog, I'll never forget how oppressive it felt. All of our gear was sopping wet with it, and I swear it was hard to breathe the air. The fire was nothing but a smoulder, despite the fact that it had been roaring bright 20 minutes ago. Now, just as I rolled up the very last sleeping mat, there's one final, closer than before growl that shook me to my core. I snatched the mat up and took off running, getting into the truck, Duke of Hazzard style, and taking off, none of us looking back. Now for some context, I'm a Mal, and this took place when I was around 12 years old, and is probably the most terrifying night of my entire life. My name is James. My friend is called Jess. He's around 4 months older than me, but that's quite important. It was the summer of 2016 and summer vacation had just started. I was living my best life playing video games. Jess's distant grandma, that he actually never met, passed away sadly the week before, so his parents are out of town. My mum said that he could stay with us while his parents sorted out things in their hometown. Jess was staying in my room with me, which we loved. We'd actually been the best of friends for as long as I could remember, really. Now, we still are, so as teens or pre-teens do, we're intent on sleeping as little as possible each and every night. Now, one night, we decide that we're gonna sneak out. Now, this isn't for any miraculous purpose. For some reason, we just like the thrill of knowing that we'd been wandering around my block while my parents were asleep and didn't know we're out. Now, my parents are usually preoccupied with my older brother and sister anyway. So, we finally get out and went to the local park just to chill for a while. That's when we hear something that still sends shivers down my spine whenever I think of it. There's a woman scream. It didn't sound like it was that far away from where we are. Immediately, I regretted sneaking out and thought that we should run back home. But Jess wanted to investigate. He said that he was worried that somebody was getting hurt. And so I reluctantly agreed to go out and search for the source of the scream. We thought that the scream sounded like it was coming from the other side of the small forest, but we're too afraid to walk through it, so we go to the edge of the tree line. That's when we saw a woman crouched over something up ahead. She was actually facing in the other direction too, and Jess called out, "Ma'am, you okay?" And she didn't move. We didn't respond. Her hands looked bloody. We slowly moved towards her and say, "Ma'am, are you alright?" Jess said, lightly poking her back. She turned around and vomited up a liquid. It was dark brown and smelled like rusty metal. Even worse, there was something moving inside of it. We just froze and neither of us had a clue what to do. She just looked at us with this grunt face and cloudy eyes. She then runs and turns directly into the forest. Now we then see that she's been eating what appears to be a rotten deer. How that's possible I don't know. We both looked at each other and ran home. We were so scared that we didn't sleep at all that night. Whoever she was, we never saw her again. Weirdly, there's no reports of a crazy woman being found living in the forest off of the land too. We still don't understand what we saw. I can, however, say that I'm very grateful she didn't harm us and that I wasn't there alone. Now, my story took place in North Italy back in 2014 in early September. A friend of mine proposed me to make a short hike in the woods near his town, and I obviously agreed, since I love nature. We prepared our backpacks and grabbed some food and drove to the place. My friend knew the area very well, so we didn't take a map. We didn't have flashlights neither. Now, we've planned to return while there's still some daylight, and it's in early September, so daylight lasts pretty long still. As we get deeper into the woods, we saw beautiful spots, small rivers, and a pair of caves that we explored. We had lunch and proceeded to follow a trail in a deeply wooded area. After around half an hour, we were at the point about 50 minutes away from the car when we stopped so that we can take some photos and explore the area. We then arrive at a pretty large clearance, and here comes the weird part. In the clearance were a bunch of people, around 4 or 5 dressed normally. They were simply talking and laughing, nothing too weird about it, so it didn't raise alarm bells. They weren't praying in a circle or doing dreadful chants, just like super ordinary people like me and my friends just talking to each other. They obviously saw us too, since the clearance had no trees or rocks to cover the view and we couldn't avoid that. Since the trail, after a deep curve, immediately ends into a clearance, proceeding to the other side of it, we approach and we said, "Hey, what's up?" And they didn't answer and just stare back at us, not really saying a single word. Obviously, that's a big red flag. We stopped too, and I look at my mate. He looked back at me concerned too. We said again, "Hey," and there's no answer. I start feeling very uneasy, so we decide to return back to the car. But soon after we moved, we realized that they're actually following us, and we yelled, "Why are you following us? Did we do something wrong?" Yeah, we're still pretty young now, and don't really know what to do. Now, usually you should run immediately. Now, obviously, we proceed to walk faster and tried to get out of the trail. Another pretty bad choice, but my friend knew the area well. But everywhere we went, they followed with about a distance of 15 meters. We start to panic, so we looked again to each other and agreed that we have to get out of here quickly now and soon begin running. We heard that they started running too, and obviously it makes us scared. We made our best possible way out of there, putting more distance between us and them. Another thing that made me panic was the fact that, as we said, we're about 40 minutes away from the car at that point and in a pretty isolated area, so I felt really hopeless. At a certain point, when we're about halfway back, we start to notice that they aren't behind us anymore. We thought maybe that we were lucky and managed to lose our tracks, but unfortunately, I don't think that was the case. We ended up hiding behind a thick bush and tried to listen, and there's silence, no footsteps nor voices. And keep in mind that even when they're following us, they don't say a word. So we took our breath back and managed to return to the car, trying to be as quiet as possible. We jumped in the car and raced out of there, but it doesn't end yet. As we left the woods onto the main road, we saw someone coming from a secondary road, and suddenly another car appears behind us, following us again. They were surely never going to lose us now. But we're certain it's the same people because 1, they were hightailing us, and 2, the area is very rarely visited, and there's basically no cars except for my friend's one, and this doesn't have plates. We drove to my friend's town, avoiding going to his house and taking every country road, and every turn we made they did as well. As we reach the town's ingress, they actually make a U-turn and just return back to the woods. Terrified, we immediately called the police and informed them the people were in a small car and where they were heading to. Now, the police said that they showed up and did some investigation but never found anything. I was actually so scared that I ended up taking a 4-year break from hiking after this. Now, this encounter happened many years ago when I was very young, in 2001 or 2, and I was like 11 or 12 at the time. My uncle was interested in purchasing some land near Red Oak, Oklahoma. I don't know exactly where, but it was several acres in a very remote area. My father, mother, and myself decided to accompany him one Saturday to scope the property. From our home, it was a little more than a 3-hour drive, but we all loved riding in the car, so while it was not going to be the most eventful road trip, we were just excited to get out of the house. Upon arrival, I remembered being very underwhelmed with the place. No houses nearby, not even signs of life really, apart from a few birds, and the wooded area wasn't exactly what I would call picturesque. So we eventually parked the car off the road and go exploring the woods a bit. My uncle was talking about buying the land for hunting, which isn't really my cup of tea. As we walked through the woods, it was a very nice day, but something just felt kind of off. Everybody in the group actually remarks about a weird feeling, which is odd, but my dad laughs it off. My mum had goosebumps and keeps checking over her shoulder, which makes me on edge too. She is very insistent that it was weird and that she wants to leave, saying she feels like somebody's there. After a bit of hiking, I noticed a small red building. I've seen a bigger storage shed before, but it looks very well built. My uncle said that there was nothing about it on the listing, and we go and peek inside. The door was open, and inside are open cans of food, a blanket on the floor, and it smells foul. Following this discovery, we all agreed it would be best to go back to the car if there was some crazy hermit living in the woods who didn't want us to be around him. Only issue, we had walked pretty far into the woods and now weren't exactly sure what direction was correct. The eerie feeling really amped up and we're all on edge. We ended up trekking another mile before we finally found the road, but we were further down from where we had parked in the car, but at least we could just follow the road now. Walking along the road, we come across a truly unsettling sight. Right in the middle of the road in the asphalt is an animal on fire. I have no idea why it was there or why in the middle of the road or why it happened then, but it had to have been recently done. Naturally, we ran the rest of the way to the car. There was a huge scratch in the paint along all sides of it. Thankfully, the damage wasn't too bad. Now, eventually we were able to drive away as quick as possible. Needless to say, my uncle didn't buy the land, and I'll always remember the terrifying encounter. But like anything over time, it gets pushed to the back of my mind like a distant memory. The only reason I'm sharing it is I was reminded of something similar the other day. I went to high school in a small Minnesota town, mostly farmland intersected by woods, and of course dozens of small lakes. One side of my neighborhood was bordered by a relatively large marshland that you could access by a slope that wound down the trail. This trail curved through the marsh into a big patch of woods about 3/4 of a mile away. In the fall/springtime, after heavy rains, a fog would often settle over the marsh as it was much lower than the surrounding area, and it truly looked like something out of a Stephen King novel. Now, after one of these rains, my brother and I, he was 13 and I was 16 I think, decided it would be a great idea to go explore the woods in the fog. Although the sun was setting fast, we knew that we would make it to the woods in about 10 minutes if we left immediately. We grabbed a couple of flashlights, knowing that it would be dark by the time that we got home and headed for the trail. Once on the trail and moving, it hit us how thick the fog actually was. We'd only been walking for a minute or two, but had absolutely no visibility between us and about 5 or 10 feet max in front. We continued walking for a few minutes just talking, but start hearing noises and seeing red eyes in the distance the whole time. We're not sure if they're animals or what. We eventually come to a curve in the trail. This curve signaled that we're about 100 yards back from the entrance of the woods. Now at this point, there's a small lake on the left side of the trail with the marshland. Now, it's important to note that we'd moved further and further away from the houses. Our house was the closest to the trail, and the trail moved away from our neighborhood rather than bordering any backwoods. Now, we begin walking past the lake and then hear a splash. Definitely much larger than a fish. I have no idea what made the sound, but we stopped and wait and hear nothing on the rest of the journey. We couldn't have been going for another 15 seconds though, before we hear crackling and shuffling in a brush up ahead to our left. We stop dead in our tracks and wait, and at the end of our eyesight, we can only have been about 10 feet away when a figure steps out from the bush bordering the lake. The fog was too thick to make out details, but they must have been at least 6'5" and very broad-shouldered. As the figure made its way into the middle of the trail, my brother gasped and it stopped. Its head shot over and looked right at us and just stared. It felt like an eternity, but it couldn't have been more than a few seconds. It felt like a moment of pure terror that I've never felt before. I begin to take a small step backwards, and suddenly the figure takes off running into the marshland. Again, there are no houses or buildings or anything for miles in the direction it ran. Sufficient to say my brother and I sprinted back to the house faster than I ever ran before. Safe to say that I don't know what that was, and I hope I never have to find out. Now I posted this elsewhere a while back, but in the spirit of keeping this really new thing alive, I want to share my story here. Now, I was camping with my family at a provincial park in Newfoundland, Canada, mid-1980s. In Newfoundland, there's a lot of traditional folklore about fairy tales and being fairy-led, i.e. being sort of mesmerized and stolen away by the fairies. And although I've never really believed in that stuff, whenever I've heard those tales, I can't stop thinking about this experience. We arrived at the campground at around mid-afternoon. I remembered it was strangely empty. We saw no other occupied sites as we drove around looking for the perfect spot. We picked our site, and as my parents are sitting up, my older sister, and ask if she wants to go check out the little beach area, which was a shortish walk along a clearly marked downhill path through some birch woods. Our mum said yes, but told us to be back in 2 hours. We found the sign pointing us to the beach trail and headed down the path. Almost as soon as we're out of sight at the campground, things start to feel off. It was weirdly quiet, with a sort of muffled feeling. No birds calling, no breeze, just a thick, velvety silence. I also noticed that there were strange-looking ferns growing thickly along the path all around us. Ferns are not usually found in Newfoundland woods, but these were different from the ones I'd seen before. Bright, almost luminous green, and very, very large. Some were as tall as I am. Now I just cannot shake the feeling that there's people behind them or something watching me by. Although it was a very lovely, clear day, the weather started to change as we walk. A low-flying fog rolled in as we descend, first intendurous close to the ground, then gradually rising around us the lower we go towards the water. Even living in Newfoundland, I'd never walked into a fog like this before, and it did nothing to relieve the eerie feeling that I'm trying to ignore. Finally, we arrive at a steep set of wooden stairs, and following them, we emerge onto a small foggy beach. With the woods behind us, it felt very closed in, and I started wishing that we were safely back with our parents at our campsite. My sister made a small noise besides me, and I turned to see what had caught her attention, although I thought we were alone. I now noticed that there was a man several meters away standing very still and gazingly silent over the water. My sister called out a friendly hello, but he didn't move or appear to hear. After a minute or two, I start to feel nervous, so I talk to my sister about heading back to the campsite. This is where things get a bit fuzzy. I don't remember leaving the beach, but the next thing that I knew, we're walking on a wide, unfamiliar dirt road. It seems like no time has passed. But I was tired, and my legs felt like I'd been walking for a long time, much longer than what I actually had. The sun was also pretty low in the sky, which is strange because I thought we'd been gone for less than an hour. I felt disorientated and had no idea where we were, and I started to panic a bit, thinking we're lost. My sister immediately went into protective older sibling mode, saying not to worry because she's pretty sure she knew the way back. We headed off down the road in one direction that she suggested, and walked for about 45 minutes or so until we finally emerged at the campground, not far from the campsite. It was almost completely dark, and we ran to our trailer to find out that our dad was there, worried where we'd been. Although we'd thought we'd been gone for less than an hour, my dad said we'd been gone for more than 5. He said that our mum had headed to the beach to look for us while he stayed at the campsite. By now, full-on darkness is setting in, and our dad was worried that our mum might not have returned, as he prepared to look for her. She burst in the doors, frantically saying that she'd run up and down them multiple times, not finding us. She's amazed when she saw us. The only way to access that beach, aside from cutting through the woods, was to take the trail, and we hadn't passed her. Once we all calmed down and had dinner, I lay in my bunk. I remembered hearing my mum quietly telling my dad how creepy and strange the trail had felt. Although we'd planned to stay longer, we actually pick up our things early and leave much earlier than we're supposed to. When I was a junior in college, I went camping with 4 of our friends in Bald Eagle State Park in PA. We reserved a campsite that was pretty remote, pretty deep in the park, one way up the mountain. Now, not near any of the other campsites that is. It was located at the end of a narrow dirt road which is maybe 75 feet long, which itself broke off from the main road, which I think was also dirt. There was nothing at the end of the little road but our campsite. We parked at the entrance of the park and spent the day hiking up the site. Setting up camp, and then hiking around, we made a fire, made dinner and turned in. Not long afterwards, we discovered that one of the guys with us snored loudly, like shaking the walls of the tent loud. Truly deafening. After probably an hour or so, the rest of us gave up on trying to get some sleep and climbed into our tents, leaving our one friend snoring away. Now, my friend at the time was a DJ for our school's radio station, so she had a late night show. I think she was on between midnight and 2 AM. Since we couldn't sleep, we trekked up the main road where reception was better and would actually be able to hear her radio over the snores. Now, when we got to the road, we stood in a loose circle near the entrance of our site. As we stood there, a black pickup truck with its lights off appeared out of the woods and passes us, very slowly. It's not marked. It's not a ranger. Now, we listened to the radio for maybe half an hour to 45 minutes after that, and even briefly call in to say hi. Finally, we decided to head back to bed. One of the girls went off into the woods to take care of some things when I climbed into the tent I shared with her and got into my bag. A couple of minutes after, I heard the movement of leaves towards the tent coming from my right. At the same time, I also heard the unmistakable rumble of tires on the ground. I stood up and looked out of the little screen window in the tent. We hadn't bothered to put up the rainfly, as it was a perfectly clear night with a very bright moon, so I couldn't see everything. I saw my friend coming back to the tent, ducking behind it as the black truck pulls into our campsite. Now it actually still has its headlights off and then shuts off its engine and sits there. Our friend is still snoring. I have a little knife in my tent and I know my other two friends have at least one in theirs. But we have no other weapon, no guns or bear spray, so we just watch. As I said, it was a clear night. I see my truck is just fine. It's maybe 20 feet from the tent, but I can't see who's in the truck or how many people are there. Nothing seems to be moving inside the truck. I still remember the metallic clunk sounds as the engine cools off. Now, I've really got no idea how long we just watched it. My friend had ducked down behind our tent, and I could hear her breathing and that she was terrified. Neither of us said a word. It feels like a really long time that goes by, probably 10 minutes at the very least, maybe more. We just keep waiting for something to happen. Nothing did, and eventually the truck starts up again and then back down the long narrow dirt road. It never turned its headlights on. I heard it drive back in the direction that it originally come from, and that was it. My friend burst into the tent a second later saying, "God, did you see that?" And our best friend there was still asleep. Eventually we went to bed and packed up and headed out in the morning as planned. Now, a group of friends and I decided to rent a place on a lake, just for fun. Now, we're all in our young to mid-20s, and it was supposed to be a big party, and for the most part that's exactly what it was. The Friday night and Saturday morning was pretty much us having a blast there on the water, just doing stupid things. Well, naturally, when Saturday rolled around, we were all so dead from going out that we decided it would be a night of no drinking, and just kind of a chill evening. And that's what it was, relaxed. So 9 PM comes rolling around and about 8 of us are inside the house and 5 outside. The house has a 2-story with a 2nd-story deck/back porch, and it was surrounded by the woods, and then down through the woods you hit a lake. I'll mention that we had already experienced some weird vibes from the locals when we first arrived in town, mostly just backward old timers that I assumed were leering and irritated because we're a bunch of college kids just having a good time. But the town and lake was so large that it's not like anybody I knew would have been there, and I didn't know anybody was staying there. Anyway, 3 of us are up on the back porch, and my other friend and I are going downstairs outside, just talking, going towards the woods. I mean, it was otherwise just a really nice night. My friends and I just got lost in our conversation when all of a sudden I get a feeling that something's off. It's kind of like a very unnerving physical experience that came from the woods behind us. It was so strong we both had quieted down a bit, and then, out of nowhere, this loud chanting erupts from the woods. I had no idea how far away it was because of the way the lake's set up. I'm pretty sure the voices carried up through the forest. It sounded like a cult chanting away. All of them are male voices. I mean, they were loud and perfectly in sync. I think we all froze for about 20 seconds before I couldn't contain myself and dart towards the house with her following me. I don't know how to explain the feeling with the chanting, but it was almost like evil. Just like something really powerful was happening. I was shaking by the time that we got up to the 2nd story and ran out to the balcony with the other 3 friends. One of them my brother. By the time we got up there, the chanting was gone, and naturally I asked, "Did you guys hear that?" in the most shaky and freaked out voice. They all had heard it, but not the second later chanting. Now, the 5 of us out there were peering into the forest, listening to the chanting that would sometimes sound very far away and then relatively close. All of them are male voices in the weirdest language that I don't even know. It kind of sounded like a part of some weird extreme cult or church. Then following the chanting was a loud bang like somebody hitting a metal object which is huge. And then the worst came, a man wailing like in extreme pain. All of my hair was up. It was the scariest experience ever. My brother and I were staring at each other in a mixture of scared excitement and horror. The wailing stopped, and then it was back to chanting, which eventually died out. I was so freaked out by it that I wanted to call the cops, cause whoever screamed had been in a lot of pain. That mixed with the weird chanting just made me immediately think of some kind of terrible sacrifice going on. One friend tried to say it was some drunk guys messing around and singing and being weird, but there's no way that was the sound coming from them. They were perfectly in sync, and the wail of pain is really like nothing that I've ever heard before. It was just off and really messed up. Now definitely, whatever that sound was, it seemed to know that we were there. Now after a while it eventually fades out, and after that I was so ready to go home. I can't explain the feeling of relief when we were driving away the next morning. Even now, just thinking of this gives me a horrible feeling. Now to start off, I'd like to say that I'm an avid RVer, and I've travelled along coast to coast in the USA with my family and children, and the dog, an Australian Shepherd. We have been deep in the woods and heard strange noises, stayed in cities riddled with crime, and I've never felt out of control or uneasy until White Cities, NM. If you're unfamiliar with the area, there is almost nothing but desert in the surrounding areas. Roswell, NM is only about 1.5 miles north of White Cities. The area has many boogeymen in the surrounding folklore, things from skinwalkers, kidnappers, aliens and more. White City, which sits just outside of the entrance to the Carlsbad Caverns, has a population of 85 according to a quick Google search. At first, upon setting up camp, things fell off, for lack of a better word, but nothing happened to a point as for a reason why. I kept my mouth shut as to not speak or spook my wife or kids for no reason, but the entire time it felt as though we were being watched. Every turn I made had almost something ominous looming, only to find nothing, until I walked my dog later that night. My dog, a 2-year-old Australian Shepherd, is very friendly and aloof, up to the point that he had never shown any signs of aggression and only exhibited sweet behaviours. Now it had just gotten dark, and due to a long day of travelling, he needed to take a walk bad. At new places, I always kept him leashed. As we were starting around an abandoned city, I thought I saw a shadow figure moving next to the restaurant building across the street. I focused my vision, but nothing. Weird. Keep walking. Then out of nowhere, my dog jumped to attention and started ferociously barking and growling into the dark shadow near where I saw the movement. I had never heard anything close to that coming from him before or since, but there was nothing there, yet, still, he was frothing and really snarling and growling. I dragged the dog back to the camper, but I still kept quiet about it. I decided to shrug it off. I kept a close eye on the family that night. We left the next day, and my wife remarked, "So glad that we're leaving this place, it gives me the heebie-jeebies." I said why, and she said, "I dunno, just creepy here." So I looked up reviews of the campsite, and another camper said that they felt the same way as us, and that upon returning to his camp spot after a long day out, he saw a dozen cloaked and hooded people holding up candles doing some weird ritual near the site. I then took a deep dive on the internet and couldn't find anything else with regards to White City, but there was an old stone castle type structure on the hill above the campsite. I intended to go back to check it out, but I got spooked out after what happened with the dog and the other review that I read. So I don't know exactly who or what is lurking out there, but it's definitely creepy.